أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Assalamu alaikum everyone. My name is Dr. Suzy Ismail from Cornerstone, and I am happy to be with you again in our Ramadan Resilience Program, where we're learning how to better understand our mental and emotional health and see how that impacts our social and relational wellness from a spiritual perspective. So we've talked a lot about some of the elements in the verse that Allah Azza wa Jal reveals in the Quran in Surah Al-Baqarah in verse 155, where He speaks to us about how we will be tested, and that we will be tested with something of fear and something of hunger. We've talked about fear manifesting itself as anxiety and what we can do about that, and we've talked about how hunger doesn't necessarily have to be a physical hunger, but there is an emotional hunger as well. Now, when we look at these tests and we look at the impact these tests have on our lives, we recognize that the result of experiencing these tests can often be very, very heavy emotions. And those heavy emotions can sometimes look like sadness, they can look like grief, they can look like sorrow, they can also look like depression, and, God forbid, they can look like despair. And we know that as we journey through these different emotions and we journey through these different stages, each stage has different indications to help us better understand what we may be experiencing. It's very common today to enter into, a high school or a middle school and to see lots of kids and teens who are like, I'm so depressed, or, oh my gosh, I'm just depressed, or I'm going to kill myself if this happens. These are really big statements, and a lot of times they're utilized in our vernacular as almost light labels. And we want to be very careful with that labeling because we want to better understand what is it that we're talking about here. Depression, when depression is clinical or chronic, is a diagnosable illness, meaning there are specific markers that doctors look for to identify whether or not someone is depressed. Now, that's not to negate any of the emotions that may feel like depression to someone, but it's to understand that depression may be different than some of those other emotions. We often see sadness as being a first line of defense for the loss of something. When we are mourning the loss of something, we often feel sadness. We often see sorrow as a longer extension of sadness, something that can last for a longer time. We see grief as an understanding of a physical manifestation, and many times, when we talk about grief, grief doesn't necessarily go away. We simply learn to grow around our grief, not that the grief gets any smaller. Then when we move from that stage into depression, we begin to realize that depression has both chemical components as well as environmental components. So someone may be depressed because genetically they may have carried that sense of depression with them. Someone may be depressed because chemically there may be an imbalance. Someone may be depressed because environmentally they are in a situation that exacerbates that depression. Someone may be depressed because generationally they've carried childhood trauma into their adult years. And there's many different manifestations of that depression that we're going to engage with and better understand as well. And finally, that stage of despair, which is a really, really scary stage to be in. And it's a stage that we want to very much understand, and we definitely don't want to, discount it or not give it its credence, because despair is the stage in which hopelessness has reached such a height that someone chooses not to live anymore. That someone says, you know what, it's not worth it to continue. And we know that Allah Azza wa Jal reminds us that whatever test we're going through, He will give us that remedy, He will give us that solution, and that we don't want to fall into that stage of despair. So recognizing the symptoms within ourselves even, because we may have experienced some sort of loss, and that's the loss that Allah Azza wa Jal speaks about in that verse in Surah Al-Baqarah, that we will experience a loss of wealth and a loss of lives. We may have experienced that even as recently as throughout the pandemic, but how we respond to that loss is very important. So join us in our next episode as we talk about those different stages and we understand grief, sadness, sorrow, depression, and despair. We better understand them through the Islamic lens, and we recognize how the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam coped with those emotions and how we can incorporate those coping mechanisms in our own lives as well. So I'll see you during our next episode, inshallah. Jazakum Allahu khair. Wassalamu alaikum.